Hi, and welcome to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, a weekly conversation with women who found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode number 49. If you're a first-time listener, welcome. And if you're a returning listener, thank you so much for coming back. If you're looking for more information about the podcast, past guests, or want to catch up on previous episodes, or just want to drop me a line, it's all at the website, desertladydiaries.com. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Desert Lady Diaries and on Twitter as Desert Lady Diary. Today you'll hear from Dr. Catherine Svehla talking about her journey to the desert and her interest and passion, mythology, and how mythology works in our lives as we travel our individual journeys. Welcome back to Desert Lady Diaries. My guest this week is Dr. Catherine Svehla. She is the Hi-Desert's local mythologist. She is a cultural mythologist, storyteller, artist, and activist, and creates story-based programs to share the transformative power of myth. Catherine also is the host of The Myth in the Mojave, a storytelling podcast with listeners around the world. She founded and led the Hi-Desert Mythological Roundtable from 2009 to 2015, and she lives in Joshua Tree. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Tables are turned.
I'm looking forward to being on this side of it, I have to say. So.
That's cool. What was your first encounter with the desert?
Well, the first encounter, that's an interesting question. I have been thinking about that lately. The most direct answer is in 1990, I moved to Los Angeles from Boston. And my then husband and I came out to the park to go backpacking. And that just totally blew my mind. And I remember still, and he remembers still, that at the end of the backpack, we camped in Jumbo Rocks. I could probably still go back to that campsite. And took our little lawn chairs up onto the top of this big boulder and got stoned. And I looked around and I said to him, I'm going to live here one day.
It's amazing how that happens,
yeah,
isn't it?
Yeah. And then it became, over a number of years, the desert became increasingly a refuge for me. I've been thinking a lot lately about how many of the things in my life now were really seeded by experiences that I had in childhood that I've forgotten for a long time. I don't know, maybe this is a phenomenon of starting to get older. But when I was a small girl, we lived in Orange, California. And I realized that we made several trips out to Hoover Dam and to Indian reservations and deserts in Arizona and came through here. And those are some of the memories, my most vivid memories. My brother even remembers that. And so I find myself thinking about how much I was imprinted early on. Mm-hmm. Almost at the age of 3, I probably decided I was going to live in Southern California.
Right, kind of like tapped into it. That's interesting because for me it was every place I've ever lived. I was born and raised in Jersey. And every place I ever lived after that, North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, I've always decorated my home as if I was in the desert. I have these Native American prints. I had cactus, even like dish towels with cactus on them. Mm-hmm. So there was something, I say sometimes, in us that knows where we're going. We just haven't discovered it yet.
Yeah, the first, and it was a reproduction, but print that I bought for my apartment when I moved to Boston, very first thing I bought for myself that I spent more than $50 on was a Gorman print.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it? Yeah, just don't know where it comes from.
Yeah.
So after those experiences, I imagine there were a number of trips backpacking, but how did that decision happen to say, you know what, I am moving there now?
Okay, well, so over time, the desert became more and more of a refuge. I got into the habit of whatever I was doing, because I was living in Los Angeles mostly for the next 10 years or so after that initial trip. Whenever I started feeling like I was losing my mind, I would just throw my backpack and some beer in my car and drive out to Black Rock, because that was the closest place to get into the park, and put my pack on and just walk into the desert and just stop at whatever spot felt good and have a beer and sleep on the ground and get up in the morning and walk around and go home. So that feeling got more and more and more intense. And then right around fall of 2000, I was anticipating turning 40. And I was single. I didn't have a job. I didn't have an apartment. I was broke. I didn't have anything. And I felt totally free. This was not a depressing situation. It was one I knew I was going to have to remedy, obviously, right. At least the money part of it. But I thought, God, I'm about to turn 40, and I feel like I've let myself get off track. Mostly getting involved with other people and then getting involved in their dramas.
Right.
It was like, what do I want to do? And I made two decisions that have been increasingly I've understood how closely related they were. One was, I want to go to graduate school in some sort of Jungian thing, which ended up being my PhD in mythology, and I'm going to move to the desert. I realized that I had a way to support myself finally in the desert because I'd become a massage therapist. I've done a bunch of different things. Mm-hmm. In the interim, so I thought, I can get a job finally. And so I moved out here in January of 2001.
Great time to move.
Yeah.
Not like me, July and August.
Yeah, but in a way, your initial experiences are either confirmed for you that you're really cut out for it or not.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so 2001.
Okay.
And then I started my graduate program in September of 2001.
And was that up here?
It was at Pacifica Graduate Institute, which is in Carpinteria, just south of Santa Barbara.
Okay.
But the way that their programs are set up, you go once a month for several really intense days in a row. And then other than that, you're on your own. I mean, it's graduate school, so you're reading and writing. And
gotcha.
I just commuted for those little seminars and then came back here. Yeah.
So let's back way up to Boston. What brought you to LA from Boston?
The weather.
I understand.
And also, the man I was married to then, his family lived in Los Angeles. And I just had this thing about Southern California, which I didn't really know where that came from.
Right.
But I realized that as soon as he said, I'm getting really tired of the cold and the slush and waiting for the bus that's always seems to be 45 minutes late when it's raining and it's only 30 degrees or 25 degrees out and all of that. When he said, let's move to Los Angeles, I realized that some part of me knew that that was going to be the next thing that we were going to do. In fact, we even talked about whether or not we should live someplace else because once we got to LA, we probably wouldn't leave Southern California.
Wow.
I have briefly a couple of times. So that's how it ended up happening.
Right.
And then once I moved to LA, and we lived in Venice Beach, which is where I lived in LA most of the time I was there, the contrast between the energies and the culture of East and West, I found that very interesting because I was still going to the East Coast a lot for work. And I would sit on the subway with my dangly silver Day of the Dead earrings and my super short bleached hair and my cowboy boots and among all the other women that were wearing their tennis shoes and their hose and their little nylon shells with a little button in back, and I realized I definitely made the right choice
right, for
before
sure.
I went down that path.
So when you moved to Joshua Tree, did you know anyone here?
No.
So how did you establish your community? How did that happen for you?
Well, I didn't. It ended up being a very interior time for me because of the graduate school process. So my community really was my colleagues that I was seeing once a month. And because I was working down the hill, I was doing the massage, but I was trying to make as much money as possible in a few days as possible. So I was working at a big resort down in the low desert on the weekends. So my life just really wasn't set up to do a whole lot here, which was okay because I had the group at Pacifica, but also because the main reason I moved out here was to cultivate my relationship with the desert itself. And I had a lot of time to walk and go running and process my ideas for the things that I was writing in the desert and in the park specifically. However, there is one person that became a very good friend of mine here, and it's kind of a funny story. So I said I didn't have any money when I got here. The first morning I woke up at my rental house and I realized there was no water. Of course, it didn't ever occur to me moving from LA that I had to turn the water on.
Oh.
So I called the rental company and they're like, oh yeah, no, you have to. And I was like, okay, it would have been nice to have told me that. But so I went to Crossroads, which was just a couple blocks away from where I was living. And as I was sitting at the counter having a cup of coffee, I noticed all these people coming in and getting their morning coffee and talking. And they didn't have any baked goods for people to take with them. And in one of my other
Lives.
phases of life, one of my other incarnations, I was a baker at a cafe. And so I was sitting there, and this lesbian couple, Chris and Shelley, owned the place back then, and they were working behind the counter, and I said, hey, have you ever thought about having anybody come in and do any baking for you for the morning? So anyway, I ended up working there, doing that for a while. After a couple of months, they said to me, we have this other woman named Sarah who is here in the afternoon. She's a barista doing the coffee thing, and I think she's going to do the same thing you are, that myth program. And of course I thought they just didn't understand the ins and outs of what I was doing, because there was no way in hell that there were two people going to go to this obscure graduate program who happened to live in Joshua Tree and had just moved there.
But it is Joshua Tree.
Yes. Well, so that summer, a couple months later, in the afternoon, I thought, I'm going to get an ahi tuna sandwich to go from Crossroads. And I walk in to pick up my food, and they said, Sarah's here. And as soon as they pointed to the table where this woman was sitting, and I saw the stack of books that she was sitting with, I was like, oh my God, she's going to Pacifica too. So she became a very good friend of mine, and still is. And it was very funny. She moved from Santa Barbara almost exactly the same time that I moved here. She's like a year younger than I am. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And I did, through her, meet some other people, and through Crossroads meet some other people.
Sure.
But many of them are not around anymore, because that 2001 is kind of a long time ago now.
Right,
Even for the desert. So.
Right. And do you think that is because, I don't know, some of us say the desert has a way of sorting people out, or do you think that people come, get what they need at that moment, and have moved on? How do you think that?
I think both of those things are true. I also think that life circumstances change. There are specific things that people want when they come here, and then sometimes your priorities change. If somebody gets sick, or, so let's say your parents live on the East Coast, and suddenly you feel like you need to be close to them. I mean, that sort of thing happens a lot too. True.
Do you feel a sense of isolation here?
No, I never feel isolated here because there's too much around. But my primary relationship with this place is with the place. So I don't ever feel isolated because there's always a creosote bush nearby, or a bird, or a lizard, or a rabbit, and eating my cactus down to the ground. And I have tended to live with animals. It's been years since I haven't had a cat or a dog. Some amount maybe of loneliness now and then, because those aren't complete substitutes for human beings. I'm not that much of a misanthrope, but that's fairly easy to remedy, because you just have to get in your car and go to one of the places where people are hanging out. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about the desert, and that one of the reasons it works for me, is that I am essentially a hermit, but I don't want to be by myself all the time, and my work involves other people. And we get to indulge both of those things. You're not a weirdo if you want to spend 4 days by yourself, miles away from anybody else. Right. But then when you come into town, everybody else who's there wants to talk to people. And, so it's a really friendly place. And once people kind of get a sense of what you do, what your contribution is, then I think it's easy to find your place and be accepted in. And
I agree. And it doesn't take long. I mean, if you go out and about, you find your people fairly quickly. Yeah. Which is great. Mythology. Yeah. Where did the interest and inspiration come to pursue that sort of subject?
Well, at another point in my life, when I was also kind of at loose ends, which again, I interpreted as being an opportunity to do whatever I wanted to do. This time, I had just finished a year in art school. I went to Otis in Los Angeles for a year at the undergraduate level, because I had started painting a couple of years before that. And then I realized, art is really changing the way that I think about my life and see things. And I wonder if I could get some actual training in it. And so I went there for a year. And when I got done, I moved to the Sandia Mountains outside of Albuquerque and kind of hunkered down in this little space that was owned by some people I'd met on a Sierra Club trip years before that. Anyway, living there, and that's also where I became a baker. While I was living there, I was painting mostly and looking at art. And one of the reasons I moved to New Mexico was to look at art, and in particular to go to the pueblos. And I got really interested in pottery and pottery designs. And I was reading and reading and reading and reading and reading and reading and reading. And more I started reading books on mythology and thinking about how images and what the visual language of stories is
that
like.
Because there were designs in this pottery that were interesting and...
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, one of the things, and this is just kind of a generalization. Well, it is a generalization. So I just want to preface this by saying I'm not an expert on any of this. So, but the way that I understood a lot of the pots and the rugs and other things that I was looking at was that there's story embedded in them. I mean, part of the act of creating them is that you are creating them and why you're doing it. And then also the symbols that are employed are all referencing narratives that people know. And if you're in the culture, then you understand a lot of that.
It's
you don't
more
have
obvious,
to go and
right?
like look it up, but I wasn't. And so I just started reading more myth. And then I picked up a book that was edited by Theodore Roszak on ecopsychology, and it's a collection of essays basically about what the relationship is between the land, the earth itself, and our experience of that, and our culture and mythologies. And the word myth was being used broadly, not just as stories about things people used to believe in, but as narratives that we're still telling and living in. And so the myth of progress, for example, would be a myth, secular myth that was in this book. And I got really fascinated by that. It connected me to one of my initial career out of college, which is why I was living in Boston. I was a community organizer around environmental issues. And I'd left that because I just couldn't bear the politics. I don't know how people are doing it now because it's 1,000 times worse than it was in the early 80s. But, I never stopped thinking about and acting. That's one of the reasons that activist is in that bio. That has always been a very important part of how I think about what I'm doing. And so suddenly I felt like I was discovering a new way of thinking about and being part of changing attitudes that didn't involve exchanging facts with people who had vested agendas that ultimately weren't going to change. And why? Because they were myths. So this opened a lot of doors for me in terms of feeling like I might, in fact, be able to find a way to bring all of these threads of my life together somehow. Because I've always kind of wondered what the hell I'm doing. Like my life feels very coherent.
I don't think you're alone in that.
Yeah, my life, there's a certain, day to day it feels very coherent. And like I have a sense that I've been steering myself in the right direction by and large. But to say, oh, well, I grew up in Missouri and everybody thought I would be a lawyer and go into politics. And instead I took a public interest job for nothing in Boston and did community organizing and then left that and ended up going to art school and then writing college papers for people and then being a baker and consulting with nonprofits and studying art and wandering around, it's like...
But, I think that brings up a very important point that maybe some of our listeners that are younger and just starting their lives need to hear, that you're not locked in. We ask them to get locked in at 18, 19, 20, 21, but the fact is... it changes.
Yeah.
Like you said earlier, moment to moment, you get involved with other people, you get involved with other jobs, it just changes. And I think that's important for people of that age to hear.
Oh, I agree. I agree. And, it's interesting to me that's where you take the conversation, because I've had so many conversations with colleagues who are still in institutions. still working with public interest organizations or associated with other groups that I've been associated with, and they complain a lot about the millennials because they don't know how to buckle down, and they won't. And I think to myself, that's because they have a clue. They're growing up in a very different world than I did.
Me too,
for sure.
Right.
And I do think that, again, a generalization, but I do think that as a generation, they're more interested in experience than accumulating security. And that, I'm sorry to say, is the primary motivation that a lot of people my age and older had for what they did. And
that's true.
I mean, no judgment, but hey, times have changed and there really is more to life. And this is a funny place where it kind of comes back to the mythology. I was aware of Joseph Campbell, who did the Hero's Journey and definitely is the best known and probably the most popular still mythology of kind of contemporary times. And the other thing that Campbell's really famous for, in addition to the Hero's Journey, is the notion of follow your bliss. That didn't make a big impression on me at the time that I heard it in the late 80s. But as a mythologist now and someone who does dip into Campbell's work, more and more that statement has meaning for me. Find what's really valuable to you.
Right.
Find what you love and dedicate yourself to that. And unfortunately, for more and more people, there's not a job out there that's going to let you do that.
No, you really have to kind of make your own way, really, if you're going to stick to it.
Yeah.
For sure.
So as much as I abhor, for other reasons, the terminology of be your own brand, and some of this other stuff that does seem very narcissistic and sort of off the fact that there are so many young people who see themselves and their lives as their own enterprise and are trying to find that thing. What do I want to contribute? Where is the marriage between who I am and what I really have to offer and the needs of the culture? I think that's fantastic.
When I got to LA first, it was for, the acting thing. And there were so many classes on, branding yourself. But I found that many of them were not necessarily being authentic.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, you have this look. So when you go to this audition, you have to play up that look. But you know what? Inside me, that's not who I am. I may look that way, but that's not who I am as a person. So all of that stuff kind of felt a little off to me. And I think I made a post on social media at some point that I was like, I think I figured out what my brand is. I don't give a shit about brand.
You and I have the same brand.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
I was authenticity just seems to be where I live. It's just who I am, and I don't know whether that's my jersey that comes out. Because there's so much of that there. But yeah, just being who you are and being authentic to yourself and what you love to do makes your life just so much better.
Yeah. I mean, this message is one of the messages that's, I guess sometimes they say it overtly, but that is buried in the work that I do with people as a mythologist. I mean, if I had to sum that all up in one sentence, I would say, you can use myths and stories as tools to help you uncover what really matters to you and to give yourself permission to take that seriously and throw off the cultural conditioning.
Or even the in-home conditioning. I mean, there's a lot of that. You're in my generation, probably more so, and it peters off from there. But I think a lot of us came out with, you need to have this job that's going to pay your retirement, blah, 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 blah. You're not going to make any money being an artist. You're not going to, and that's just the way it is.
Yep.
And those are stories. Yep. Because that's somebody else's story that is being projected on their children.
Yep.
And then you get to a point, finally, sometimes, when you realize, you know what? That is not my story.
Right.
And I can change that, and I'm going to change it. But then there's the fear. What are some of the things that you employ to show people that the fear is kind of what's standing in their way?
Well,
or blocking them.
Yeah, well, the stories are good tools for pretty much anything. They're good medicine for pretty much anything that ails you. So it depends a little bit on who I'm talking to and what the context is. But if you take a story that we know has been told for at least 1,000 years, maybe 2,000 years, who knows before that?
Right.
That's one thing that we know for sure is that stories predate any historical record. If you take a story that's really old and you see that those fears were part of the experience that's embedded in the story then, suddenly it's like, oh, I'm not alone. This is part of the experience. Part of making this choice is encountering this fear. And so I can take courage from that. I think a lot of the times we get stopped by fears because even though we're not consciously thinking this, we're sort of assuming that we're the only ones who have that and that it belongs to us rather than, no, you have enough courage and imagination to imagine doing something that's big enough that fear is going to be part of it. So join the crowd,
right.
Go for it, because whatever you do is going to inspire other people. And in fact, the more upfront you are about what you're afraid of, the more people you're going to find who are in the same place or just got out of it and have something to share with you.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons that I like to use stories that are in the canon, so to speak, stories that a lot of people know or that have been in the culture for a long time, rather than personal story. I applaud the explosion of interest in personal stories and the resources that are available for people to find that and share that, and there's a lot there. But we have all these resources, all of these cultural resources that we can be using that we have in common, that have vocabulary and speak to experiences that we've all had. And dipping into those things can really deepen your understanding of your own personal story, but also make connections between people happen even faster, as odd as that might sound.
Just sharing that common ground sometimes really can be helpful, knowing that you aren't the only one, or seeing someone else has gotten past something that you're fearing, and you can take that as inspiration.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you found what you were looking for here in the desert, or that you've that this is a place where you're going to stay?
I don't know. For right now, yes. But I don't know that I could completely articulate what it is I'm looking for. And also things change. The environment changes. So one thing that I do know that I have been looking for, or that I need, is to be kind of on the edge of things. And this is something that mythology, and also, my degree in mythology was mythology and depth psychology. So thinking about what the archetypal patterns are, and going back to that eco psychology, how does the land impact us? Mm-hmm. Being in the desert is being on an edge. Yeah. And I know now that I need to be on an edge. Okay, so will I always stay here? Well, I don't know. Is the desert always going to be a habitable edge? I already feel like Joshua Tree is done for me because there's too many people here.
Yeah.
There's too much going on. You can't see the weirdos. And that's why I moved here. Mm-hmm. So I want to go further out. And there's a lot of things going on, obviously, with climate. And we are, even if we live here very sensitively, we are not really meant to be here the way that we live here. We just use too many resources. So at some point, either by force of Mother Earth or conscience, I might feel like I need to leave because I'm damaging the thing that I love too much by staying. Then I'll look for another edge, and I don't know where that'll be.
Right.
And there may be other things too, But I think a lot of people come to the desert for that. They might put it in other ways, but
right. Yeah. No, I completely feel that. Yeah, for sure. If somebody were interested in learning more about myth, are there some recommendations that you have for them for reading material or resource material, your podcast, things like that?
Well, certainly I would like to plug my podcast, Myth in the Mojave. So Myth in the Mojave, most of the time I tell a story and then work with it. I pull out a theme or two, something that is interesting to me about it. So listening to that, in addition to being told what I hope will be an entertaining story, you get some advice or demonstration on how to reflect on the story and use whatever the story might have stirred up in you. So that's a way of understanding more about both the content and also the practice of using mythology. Other resources, I mean, it's a very broad field, so
is there
it'd be easier to answer that question if what kind of mythology?
Oh, I see.
Yeah, but I would say that work of Joseph Campbell is very relevant, both as a resource for understanding myths, getting information about myths from around the world. He was a comparative mythologist, and also understanding why mythology is important now. I will add that a lot of people, including myself, find his books pretty dense. Mm-hmm. And so if one of your listeners has that experience or has had that experience, go to the Joseph Campbell Foundation website and get his audio. And I think some of it is also in the form of podcasts that are available through iTunes. But listening to him is incredible.
Well, and everybody takes in information differently, too. Mm-hmm. Sometimes visual isn't the best way.
A lot of people still find, including myself, value in Clarissa Pinkola Estes' book, Women Who Run with the Wolves. And together, a great example of good stories told by someone who weaves in a lot of what interests her, but also demonstrates what you can do with stories. There's just so many. I mean, and then, of course, there are a million books on specific mythologies from specific cultures, but those are the first few that come to the top of my head, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if someone were to say to you, Catherine, I'm moving to the desert, what would some of your recommendations, admonishments, warnings, what would some of the things be that you would tell them about moving to the desert?
Well, I'd like to know why they wanted to move to the desert. Cherry picking the community here. But I would say that if you're going to move to the desert, move here with the intention and the expectation that the desert as a presence and a place is going to impact you, and let that happen.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's going to mean taking care of yourself, making sure that you're drinking enough water, realizing that when it gets to be late spring, you can no longer go on your usual daily hike with just a little bottle of water with you because things happen. That will mean, hopefully, that you'll slow down, that you'll spend more time outside, especially that you spend more time outside looking at the night sky. I think anyone who moves to the desert and doesn't spend time outside in the darkest space they can get to, in silence, regularly, is missing one of the greatest gifts of this place.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we might have talked about this earlier, or it may have been in our pre-conversation, but you asked me a question about isolation, and I said, I don't feel isolated, but having a sense about your level of sociability is a good thing. And there's nothing wrong with living closer to town and experimenting with being out. I have seen a lot of people come and get a place out in Wonder Valley or something where they're miles and miles and miles away from people, and they can't take it. And that's too bad, because there were a lot of things they loved, but they underestimated their need for people.
That's great advice. Well, I'm so glad you came to talk today. This was very good. We could talk for more.
Yeah, really.
But it's a 30-minute podcast. So.
Yes. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely.
It's nice to be asked about the desert specifically, because I do love it.
I think those of us that are here really do, too.
Thanks so much for listening to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast. I want you to know how much I appreciate you taking the time to tune in. If you heard something that inspired or enlightened you, I'd love to hear about it. Send an email to desertladydiaries@gmail.com or start a discussion with other listeners at the Desert Lady Diaries Facebook page. Next week, mom and musician Faith Chinock talks about her arrival to the desert, the music she makes with her husband, the world of homeschooling, and provides a few local resources for stressed parents. And if you like this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe and share it with a friend. Thanks so much for listening.